Hello. My name is Stephanie and welcome, or if you're coming back, welcome back. Either way, I'm glad you're here and I hope you're well. And today we're talking about one of my favorite books of all time, the unhinged masterpiece that is Leaves a Fortune by Linda Barlow, and why I think it would make a phenomenal Lifetime miniseries, because this book truly has everything: ghosts, murder, drug smuggling, toxic family dynamics, arson, witchcraft, tea, literal and otherwise, hauntings, reincarnation, soulmates, seances, secrets, Cotton Mather, of all people, lies, God, so many lies, and rich people drama. It sounds like I'm joking, but those are all major plot points, but we'll get to that. So, spoilers for Leaves of Fortune by Linda Barlow, but also a pretty major content warning for incest. There's a lot of it. Homophobia, internalized homophobia, suicide, suicidal ideation, SA, CSA, intimate partner violence, dubious consent. Again, a lot of that. Misogyny, substance abuse, and disordered eating. All jokes aside, it's kind of a lot. It's a lot. But my God, is it an absolute journey. But before we begin that journey, some technical stuff. Messiness of this book aside, and I mean that with all love and light, believe you me, I genuinely think Leaves a Fortune is pretty well written. The pacing is solid from beginning to end, and considering the multiple character POVs and timelines, that's pretty impressive that it's able to stay so consistent throughout. The characters are all interesting and have distinct voices. Again, considering the multiple POVs across several timelines, that's pretty impressive. Some of them are a little more developed and dimensional than others, but there's a good balance of characters, so it works itself out, in my opinion. There are a lot of different plot threads in this book, and it can kind of give you whiplash, but they all have at least some kind of payoff. Again, some more satisfying than others, but there is always payoff for all the plot threads. Some of the dialogue can get a little soapy and overly dramatic, but the entire book is soapy and overdramatic, and full disclosure, I'm a soap opera girly, so, I like that. And while this book is long, it never feels particularly long because I think there's just so much going on, and again, because the pacing is so solid. All that being said, there's some, let's say, questionable stuff that's romanticized to an uncomfortable degree, and to be kind of blunt about it, I'm not wild about all the incest. There you go. Every man in this book is a whole walking, talking red flag, and it's just kind of glossed over, which again, I don't love. It's not a perfect book by any means, but it's a fun, soapy, messy read, and I like drama, so I think it's a good time. And because it is so delightfully messy, I think it would make a fun Lifetime miniseries. Seriously, it's got all the hallmarks of one of their masterpieces, and I'm being completely serious when I say that. There's nothing I love more than a bad Lifetime movie, and it's got it all. Family drama, soapy dialogue, cocaine, rich people mess, forbidden romance, and completely unhinged subplot. And again, ghosts. Did I mention the ghost? And arson? There's a lot of arson too. Lifetime, my DMs are open, and I do have a price, and most importantly, a vision. So that's the technical stuff and my pitch to Lifetime. So now let's get into the messy drama that is Leaves of Fortune. So, Leaves of Fortune is a family drama that follows the absolute saga of the Templeton family, an obscenely wealthy family that owns and runs a massive tea company. And when I say they're wealthy, I mean there's the 1% and then there's these people. They're literally the oldest of old money. But for all their wealth, the Templeton family is plagued by tragedy, and they have a tendency of dying young and dying very bad. The head of the company, the aptly named Templeton Tea, and matriarch of what's left of the family, is Minerva Templeton. And she's been running the company for the last 60 years, ever since her husband Edward was killed in World War II. I'm going to get more into her backstory in a bit, but Minerva is extremely ruthless in her business and very controlling when it comes to her family. In her eyes, she's only doing what's best for them in order to protect them, but often what she does, despite whatever her intentions might be, it often comes across as capriciously cruel, and her actions often do significantly more harm to the ones that she loves and is trying to protect than good. The main story, which serves as our framing device, takes place in 1986. We're also in Boston. That's important. Remember that we're in Boston. Specifically on Minerva's 80th birthday, which was the age that she'd said she planned to step down as head of Templeton Tea and retire, and not only that, but name her successor. Minerva and her husband Edward had 2 children, Jonathan and Lizzie. We're going to talk more about them later, but for now, all you need to know is that Jonathan is a doctor who left the country years ago, and he and his mother are estranged and have been no contact for decades at this point. He had no interest in the family business anyway, and then there's Lizzie, who Minerva initially wanted to take over for her, but sadly she died very young and very suddenly. But Minerva also has 3 grandchildren. Nick and Travis are Jonathan's sons, and her only granddaughter, Delilah, who was Lizzie's only child. Travis is the oldest of the 3, and he is very blonde, materialistic, and shallow. Been working at Templeton Tea as a vice president since he graduated from business school, basically, and feels that he's owed the CEO position because he's put in the work. Nick is his younger brother, and he has no interest in the company, again, like his father Jonathan. He's a very successful writer, kind of in the vein of Tom Clancy, if that makes any sense, and he's the closest to Minerva at this point in time. Really the only one who can see through the hardened facade that she puts on. And he's a decent enough guy compared to his brother, at least on the surface in the beginning. Put a pin in that. Nick is also recently divorced with a 7-year-old daughter. She doesn't play much of a role in the story, but she's there sometimes. What you really need to know about Nick is that Nick is a nice guy. Do you hear me? Nick is a nice guy. Okay? So, for those of you playing along at home, Minerva's son is gone, her daughter and husband are dead, Nick doesn't want the company, and Travis is the ambitious VP who very much does, so naturally he's a shoo-in, right? Wrong. Because Delilah, remember I mentioned her earlier, the youngest of the 3 grandchildren and the only granddaughter, has come home after being in California where she founded her own successful tea company, a herbal tea company called Merlin's Magical Ruse. Which is hard for me to say. She and Minerva had a falling out in 1970, and she hasn't come home to Boston in all that time, so 16 years at this point. But she is recently widowed and sold her company to her business partner, and she has come home at last. Once upon a time, Minerva and Delilah were incredibly close. She essentially raised Delilah after her mother died, and her father metamorphosized into a human trash can. More on that later. Minerva wanted Delilah to someday succeed her in running Templeton Tea until their relationship imploded. Now, Travis, Nick, and Delilah all grew up together, and despite the clashes between Nick and Travis, which were frequent and pretty violent, all 3 of them were very close. Okay? They were very close. And if you remember the content warnings I gave you earlier, you'll no doubt see where this is going. And where this is going is an incestuous love triangle. No, really. Nick has been in love with Delilah, his cousin. Again, his cousin Delilah. I think I'm the only one who's bothered by that, but I digress. Since they were kids. But Travis has always been more conventionally attractive and very, very charming. So Delilah was infatuated with him and even had a torrid love affair with him when they were in college. Put a pin in that. So again, get ready for not just a love triangle, but an incestuous love triangle. Like I said, there's a lot of incest in this. Delilah is very chic. She is very cool. She is very successful. She's also very charming, very funny, very personable. She's also deeply unhappy and incredibly lonely. And like Minerva, she has hid herself behind this wall that she's built, because if she's behind that wall, she can't be hurt again. Now, Nick is one of the few characters in this book that can, read a room, and he knows that Delilah hasn't come home because she wants to reconcile or because she really wants to celebrate Grandma's 80th birthday. She's here to fight for the company she feels is her legacy. Not just her legacy, the company that she feels is owed to her. And Nick tells her as much when he asks her to please have some mercy and some pity for their grandmother. And again, because he can read a room, he also knows that this isn't just about Delilah coming home to take over the company. Lock horns with Travis if you must, but have a little pity, if it's in you, for her. Pity? Dear God, it would be an insult to her to offer Minerva Templeton pity. She's 80 years old, and in full command of her faculties from everything I've heard. She may well be the worthiest opponent I've ever had. She needn't be your opponent anymore. I wish you would stop thinking of her as such. Delilah shrugged. It was difficult to think of Grendane in any other terms. That's like her, little nickname for her grandma. Is that why you've come back? To do battle with her? There are several reasons why I've come back. She was aware that she sounded defensive. How strange that he could do that to her. I've done everything I wanted to accomplish at Merlin's. I was born here. My roots are here. Minerva Templeton is my grandmother, and there was a time when she wanted me to succeed her. You want revenge. You're planning to nail her, and Travis too. Nick is absolutely right. It's about revenge. Delilah was deeply hurt by her family all those years ago, and she wants someone, Minerva specifically, to answer for the pain that she was caused. And Minerva, the older she gets, the more her sins and secrets are beginning to weigh on her, as are the many mistakes she's made. She's very, very haunted by her past. She's also being literally haunted by a ghost. So Minerva lives in the Templeton family home called the Tavern, and lately she's been experiencing some weird things because the house is haunted by the ghost of Helen Templeton, who founded Templeton Tea back in the 18th century. And Helen is one of the coolest characters in this book, and Linda Barlow, should this ever reach you, first of all, big fan, and second, I would love a Helen Templeton book. So she lived in England, and before coming to the States, she actually survived the Black Plague and the Great Fire of London. And upon coming to the States, she practiced herbal medicine, which led her to making her own tea and creating the company. She also never married. Put a pin in the never married thing, that's going to come back. So naturally, because of her not being married and her affinity for practicing herbal medicine, she was accused of witchcraft as a young woman. Because it was Boston in the 18th century. But thankfully, she managed to avoid, being put to death. Except, unlike the other people accused of witchcraft, she was actually a witch. And just as kind of an aside, I want to give kudos to Linda Barlow, because the witchcraft, while it is not historically accurate per se, the brand of witchcraft that we see Helen practice is closer to what you'd see modern practitioners practice. It's very well written, and some research clearly went into it. I like that. I'm a history girl. I'm a fan of research. I'm a fan of good research. We're going to circle back to Helen when we get into the seance portion of today's show, but know that the family home is haunted by a witch's ghost. It happens. Just before her birthday party, I'm guessing for maximum drama, which I respect, Minerva calls her grandkids in to make their pitches as to why the company should go to them. Both Travis and Delilah do, while Nick just kind of chills because he just wants to write books and vibe. Which, while I don't like him, that's very, very relatable. And she hears them out. But when it comes time for her to announce her retirement and her successor, because Minerva is, and excuse the language here, and know that I mean this with all love and light, a messy bitch who lives for drama, she instead announces that she will not, in fact, be retiring. Not only is she not retiring, she's going to be dividing the day-to-day duties of running the company between Travis and Delilah. And at the end of a full year, so on her 81st birthday, whoever is the most successful will inherit the company. And they're both understandably upset by this, but they're also not going to back down from a challenge, especially against each other, not with all the history there. So they both accept. And after her 80th birthday party, which it was a good party scene, and I wish we kind of got more of that in this book, and I like the little detail of them serving tea instead of alcohol. I thought that was cute. Minerva goes back to her, again, haunted house. Minerva has not been sleeping well. She's been plagued by nightmares, she's up all night, and just has kind of been generally feeling ill at ease in the house. Until she moved her bed, which is in Helen's old room, into a massive 9-foot wide perfect circle that was literally burned into the floor to the point where even 200-ish years later, it cannot be removed. And also there's really no explanation for how it got there. And one night, Minerva felt compelled to get up and move her bed. Again, she's a little 80-year-old woman, into the circle, and now this is the only place in the house where she feels at peace and even remotely safe. Now it's time for very abridged witchcraft explanations with Stephanie. I'm your host. So what Minerva is sleeping in is a magic circle, which, to put it super simply, is exactly what it sounds like. It's a circle of space marked out by some, but not all, magic practitioners for various purposes, like containing energy, forming a sacred space, or to provide protection, or all of the above. Again, this is a very oversimplified explanation and doesn't reflect all practices, but put a pin in that nonetheless. So, while lying in bed, Minerva reflects on her strained family relationships and her regrets and the secrets she's kept that could destroy everything. But before we get into Minerva's backstory and the road that led us here, it's time for very abridged history explanations with Stephanie. I'm again your host. And our topic today is British colonization and the tea industry in India. So, tea has been a popular drink for literally millions of years, but it really exploded in popularity in Europe because of the transatlantic slave trade. Cane plantations were established in the Americas and the Caribbean using slave labor, and sugar began to be produced on a much larger scale, and thus it became a lot cheaper to get in Europe. And people started adding it and milk to their tea, and it too became an incredibly popular drink. And in the 18th century, tea was almost exclusively grown in China, and Britain was buying massive quantities of it, and to be blunt about it, they didn't really have anything China wanted. So they tried and failed to manipulate the market in their favor. Enter the East India Company, who, in addition to cultivating and selling opium in excessive quantities to China, leading to the Opium Wars, 20% of the population of the people in China being addicted to opium in 1906, also started establishing tea estates in India in the 1830s, using plants brought from China, though most of them ended up dying not long after they were planted. Growing tea is an incredibly labor-intensive process, and the initial plan was to use slave labor. But slavery in the British Empire was banned in 1833. So instead, the East India Company started using indentured servants, who were trapped in their contracts and lived in absolutely appalling conditions, and they were horribly mistreated. It's not as simple as all that, of course, but necessary to know moving forward. Like I said, I like this book a lot, but it does romanticize some things that definitely shouldn't be. As always, all relevant articles are linked below. Why the mini history lesson? Well, because Minerva grew up in India, her family ran one of those aforementioned tea plantations in Darjeeling. And the whole indentured servant thing is really kind of glossed over, and that bothered me, so here we are. Her mother ran off when she was a toddler, and her father remarried when she was a teenager. Unfortunately, he passed away not long after he remarried and left ownership of the plantation to her stepmother, who really had no idea how to run it, and it started failing. Enter Harrison Templeton, a newly arrived tycoon from America who immediately lays on the charm and begins sleeping with Minerva's widowed stepmother and helping, please picture the sarcastic air quotes, her with the business. And Harrison starts running it like a tyrant. Not only that, he tricks Pamela, Minerva's stepmother, into signing the plantation over to him, and he then proceeds to bring his wife and son there. Disgraced, Minerva leaves to go back to her family in Bombay, but Minerva stays behind. And Minerva is not going to let this slide. So she comes up with a plan, and that plan is to marry one of Harrison Templeton's rivals at one of the nearby plantations, which he has a lot of because he tends to sleep with other people's wives, and then get her family's plantation back and force Harrison and the Templetons out. And then Harrison Templeton assaults her. And she's found by his son Edward, and she tells him that she fell, and he takes care of her. Edward is very much the opposite of his father. He's soft-spoken and kind and shy and studious, and Harrison Templeton hates him for it, and is horribly cruel to him and his mother. And while she initially considers using Edward as part of her revenge plan, Minerva starts to fall in love with him, and he's just over the moon in love with her. Except Minerva is pregnant from Harrison's assault, and if she has the baby out of wedlock, because Harrison will either deny that he assaulted her or say that she seduced him, and she's an orphaned young woman, so even if she told anyone, there's a pretty significant chance that no one was going to believe her. So she decides to end her pregnancy. And with the help of her childhood nanny and the nanny's daughter, whom she tells what happened to her, she attempts to end her pregnancy but is unsuccessful. Distraught, she turns to Edward, who knows none of this. She never ever tells another soul any of this, for comfort, and he assures her that he loves her and wants to marry her no matter what. And the two sleep together for the first time. Minerva never ever tells him or anyone else what happened to her. And against his father's wishes, they end up getting married, and Harrison tells Edward that Minerva seduced him because he's a scumbag. But Edward knows he's a scumbag, so he tells him to go to hell, and he and Minerva leave India and move to Boston. And it turns out Harrison had been disinherited years ago, for bad financial decisions and his excessive drinking, and his brother made Edward the heir to the Templeton Tea Company. Not long after they arrive in Boston, their son Jonathan is born. Minerva never tells anyone who really fathered Jonathan, but keep in mind that he is a result of the assault by Harrison, Edward's father. Unfortunately, that comes back in a really terrible way later. A few years later, Edward and Minerva have a second child, Lizzie. For your reference, it is 1926 at this point. That's relevant. And while Minerva is happy with her life, she has more money than she could ever spend, 2 healthy kids, and a doting husband. She's also kind of bored. When her father was alive, she helped him with the day-to-day running of the tea plantation, and when her children start attending primary, that probably aged me significantly, she takes an interest in the company that her husband is set to inherit. And she realizes that while Edward's uncle is a better businessman than his brother, he also owns a ton of loans to the bank because he's trying to build a new packaging facility, which they very much cannot afford to do. So together, she and Edward on digging the company out of the hole that it's in. And it's Minerva's idea that ends up saving them. And it's a really simple idea. Tea bags. Specifically, tea bags made of gauze, meaning that the tea flows more evenly and doesn't have an odd taste that the bags made with cellophane did. And her idea is a hit. Thankfully for them, because it's time for the Great Depression. And while the company does take a hit, it doesn't destroy them. But sadly, Edward's uncle ends up taking his own life after the stock market crash, which was an unfortunate thing that happened quite a bit. And he is the latest in a long line of tragedies that have befallen the family. Because for all their fortune and prosperity, they have a tendency to die young and tragic, to the point where some people think there's some kind of curse on the family. And this lineage of tragedy goes all the way back to Helen Templeton's son, Charles, who killed his wife and set the house on fire to kill their 2 children and then killed himself. Thankfully, the kids got rescued, but it seems like that act has haunted the family ever since. And to be blunt about it, it has. For they shall have prosperity, but neither joy nor peace. Minerva had the eerie feeling that the long-dead Helen Templeton knew something she didn't. And if she hadn't been determined not to give in to superstition, she would have ordered the portrait removed and donated to a museum. World War II happens, and Edward is killed while on business in England. R.I.P. Edward, you would have loved the electric kettle. It goes without saying that his family are devastated by this, and as her kids are barely in college and Harrison is doing God knows what in India, Minerva is now the one in charge of Templeton Tea. And she throws herself into work because it's easier than dwelling on the pain of her husband's death. This will become a pattern in her life. Not long after Edward's death, Minerva discovers her son Jonathan is gay when she comes home early and catches him and his lover together in her house. And while Minerva accepts him, he's her son and she loves him no matter what, she is terrified for him and she wants to protect him, and feels that the safest thing for him to do is to get married to a woman, which Jonathan naturally and understandably objects to. So she gives him an ultimatum. Either find a woman to marry, or I'll disinherit you, and you'll have to drop out of college and give up your dream of being a doctor. Now, make no mistake about this. Make no mistake about this. This is horrible. This is an awful thing to do to a person, much less your own child. And Minerva feels awful and guilty, and yet she does not yield, because she feels that she has to protect the family she has left by whatever means necessary, even if it means hurting them. Minerva felt sorry for her son, sorry for herself. More guilt, she thought helplessly, to carry around with her. But she had to stand firm. Other people would not feel sorry, They would brutalize his feelings, perhaps even his person, without care, without consideration. That excuse what she did? No, of course it doesn't. And this has devastating consequences for her entire freaking bloodline. Because Jonathan does get married to a former ballet dancer named Sarah. And on paper, Sarah's perfect. She's beautiful, she's talented, she's kind, she's from a good family, she's sweet. She's also deeply sad and struggles with a severe eating disorder, probably stemming from her childhood CSA. Also around this same time that Jonathan's sister Lizzie starts seeing a man named David. And David is handsome, charming, insufferable, and condescending. And yeah, Minerva doesn't like him for classist reasons, but I also maintain that she could tell his vibes were bad. But Lizzie is head over heels in love with him. And so is Jonathan. And so is Sarah. Yeah. And eventually this tension between Jonathan, Sarah, and David comes to a head, and the three of them sleep together one night. And David and Sarah have a years-long affair after that only really stops when they all start having kids. Yeah. I'm going to put a family tree up on the screen here somewhere with me. But as happy as Minerva is, and as well as things are seemingly going, she has 3 beautiful, healthy grandchildren, a literal empire, and her 2 children. This is when things begin to fall apart. And it starts with Sarah, whose eating disorder has gotten worse in the years since the affair, and she ends up hospitalized. And Nick and Travis actually end up living with Minerva for a time, while Jonathan, now a successful doctor and racked with guilt, struggles to care for her. And when it rains, it pours, because while all this is happening, Harrison Templeton returns at last. His wife died several years ago. Drinking, he's a barely functioning alcoholic at this point in his life, as his excessive gambling have left him broke. And it is 1948 at this point. Why is that relevant? I'm so glad you asked. Because India is now independent. Now, Harrison has come home, basically looking for someone to take him in because his money is gone and he has nowhere else to go. Now, why would he come to Minerva? Well, because Harrison, and excuse the language, shitty businessman though he is, has thought of this. Remember when Edward was in England during the War on Business? Yeah, while he was there, he had an affair with a woman named Mahoney, who was the granddaughter of Minerva's nanny back in India, who tried to help her end her pregnancy, and one of the only people who knew about her assault, and that Jonathan is Harrison's biological child. And Mahoney was also sleeping with Harrison and told him all this. She sadly died years earlier, having been killed by a former lover. So Harrison has come to blackmail Minerva, and he tells her that she has to take him in and support him during the final years of his life, and not only that, but sleep with him whenever he demands, because he's a scumbag, or he'll tell Jonathan and everyone else that they had an affair and she's passed off his child as Edward's, and she's done it for years. It's pointless to argue. No woman could charge a man with rape and escape with her reputation intact anyway. Reputation. Only her iron discipline prevented her from fleeing to the shelter of her home. But there was no shelter now. He twisted the knife. No doubt your friends and associates here in Boston would be quite shocked if they heard the tale. To marry a man and a child to that man's father is incest, my dear. You have no proof. If you ever betray any of this to my son or anyone else, I'll deny every word. A scandal requires no documentation, Minerva. A scandal is fire that feeds on innuendo alone. So, because she feels she literally has no choice, Minerva agrees and suffers Harrison's abuse for several years, during which he torments her and her grandchildren, until one night, while drunk, he falls down the stairs and dies. Good, I said what I said. But during this time, Jonathan's wife, Sarah, also dies, and his and Minerva's relationship never recovers, and as soon as his sons are old enough, he becomes a physician without borders and travels the world to make amends because he thinks he's responsible for Sarah's death. The hits just keep coming, because a few years later, on Delilah's 10th birthday, her mother Lizzie suffers a brain aneurysm while she's literally carrying out her daughter's birthday cake. This scene is absolutely devastating, and dies. And David, Delilah's father, slips into a deep depression and begins to drink heavily and work excessively and neglect Delilah to the point where she's only surviving on saltine crackers. So Minerva intervenes, or rather she tries to. Minerva went directly to David Schofield. She found him locked in his study, writing one of his left-wing magazine articles. This nonsense must stop, she said. She'd never liked her daughter's husband. In her opinion, he was an amoral, egocentric bastard. If you want to drink yourself to death, that's your affair. But I'm not going to let you destroy Delilah. She needs decent meals, fresh air, and exercise. She needs to be out of this mausoleum and away from you. I'm going to take her home with me. Fine, David said, hardly looking up from his work. I feel helpless with her, to tell you the truth. She's underfoot so much. You swine, Minerva thought. Same. You didn't deserve my daughter, and you don't deserve your own. Like I said, David sucks, and Delilah is shattered by this. She lost her mother, and now her father has sent her away. So Delilah grows up being raised by Minerva, and the two are incredibly close. They literally told each other everything. Like they talked about birth control and Delilah's love life. Like they were that close. And Minerva teaches her about the business because she hopes that one day Delilah will take over for her the way she hoped Lizzie would have done. As much as she did for her children and as much as she loved them, Minerva also feels that she failed them and that their suffering is her punishment for what she believes are her sins. So she tries to make up for that now with her grandchildren. She is a strict but doting grandmother, and the three of them grow up incredibly close. Too close, I'd argue, because from the time they're very young, both Travis and Nick are very much enamored with Delilah. They're also very different. Travis is more outgoing, charming, and conventionally attractive, while Nick is painfully anxious and shy. And to be blunt about it, Travis is cruel to Nick. And I don't just mean in a way that siblings are to each other sometimes. I'm one of 5, I get it. I mean, like, it seems like Travis actively hates his brother, and the feeling is mutual. While in college, Delilah gets involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement along with her father, partially because she, of course, believes in the cause, but also because she desperately wants to connect with David, who could not be less interested in her if he tried. And when Delilah is arrested at a protest, it's Travis who comes to bail her out, and the two reconnect as he's been abroad since graduating from business school. Not long after that, they begin seeing each other romantically and have a very whirlwind romance during which Delilah falls pregnant with Travis's child. So Travis suggests that they get married because he really does love Delilah and has ever since he was a kid and wants to be with her and their child. And she accepts his proposal. So, overjoyed by this, Delilah goes to tell the person she's closest to, Minerva, thinking that she'll be a little shocked but overall happy for them. Except she's not. She's horrified. Minerva had risen from behind her desk, her face dead white. You can't marry Travis. Absolutely not. I forbid it. Really, Gran, this is 1970. It's 1970 at this point, by the way. You can't forbid it. She was shaken by the intensity of her grandmother's reaction. There was an expression in her eyes that Delilah couldn't remember ever having seen before. It was as if Grandane was feeling deep, unrelenting anger, as well as something stronger, incoherent emotion that Delilah couldn't fathom. Things only get worse when she learns Delilah is pregnant. Minerva freaks the hell out and demands that she not only break up with Travis, but get an abortion or she'll disinherit them both. Which understandably makes Delilah freak out because, you can't demand somebody do either of those things. And they both say some really hurtful things, and Delilah storms out, determined to be with Travis and have their baby because she doesn't care about the money. But Travis does very much care about the money. Don't misunderstand me. He does love Delilah, but he loves the money too. So the day of their wedding, they're getting married at the courthouse, he goes to see Minerva to convince her to attend the wedding because Delilah is absolutely heartbroken, and also not to disinherit them. But Minerva will not yield and demands Travis break up with her. And Travis is like, come on, Grandma, it's the 70s. And yeah, we're cousins, but it's not that weird. Why are you making it weird? And then Minerva blows up his whole life. Telling you this in confidence, she went on. Her voice, he noted, had began to quaver. That was odd. She was so flinty, so tough. You must promise not to reveal my words to anybody, not even Delilah, especially not Delilah. Do you agree?" Intrigued now, he promised. "Delilah is your sister," she said. While Sarah was dying, she confessed everything to Minerva, who she grew really close to while she was sick. The night that the three of them, she, Jonathan, and David, all spent together, and the fact that she'd gotten pregnant from the affair, and that Travis isn't Jonathan's son. He's David's. He's Delilah's half-brother. And she has a letter that Sarah wrote while on her deathbed addressed to "my son," confessing everything. And Travis is understandably devastated by this. Like, he is shattered, and reluctantly agrees to let Delilah, who is waiting for him at the courthouse, think that he got cold feet and abandoned her. And then Minerva will handle everything else while he heads back to Europe. Again, he feels incredibly guilty about all of this, but he really doesn't see any way out. New and more accurate Templeton family tree should be on screen with me now. So Minerva shows up to where Delilah has been waiting outside the courthouse and tells her that Travis is gone and that they're going to get an abortion. So Delilah, distraught, takes off and walks for hours and hours in the rain all the way to Lexington from Cambridge, which, according to Google, is about 10 miles, until Nick, called by Minerva, finds her and takes her to a hotel. Even though he was called by Minerva, he agrees that she's out of line telling her what to do with her body and is pissed at Travis for abandoning her. Grief-stricken, Delilah propositions Nick, who is still carrying a torch for her after all these years, but quickly regrets it. He comes to the realization that she's grieving and doesn't really want to be with him. This results in a very bizarre scene where Nick nearly forces himself on her, and the whole thing is just kind of glossed over, and they kind of joke about it later, which, yeah, okay, but things are all good, sure. I said, as much as I like this book, and don't get it twisted, I very much do like this book, it also has some stuff in it that I don't love. And due to the stress, Delilah ends up suffering a miscarriage and ends up in the hospital for several days. Nick comes to see her every day, but she understandably refuses to see or speak to Minerva. And she's there for 3 days before David even bothers visiting her. And after everything that she's been through, Delilah is done begging for his attention and trying to make him care about her, and sees him for what he is, and treats him accordingly, in my opinion. And David just keeps digging that hole deeper. Wanted that baby. Travis is gone, and she was all I had. Jesus, he sat there looking stricken. You weren't around to help me. You never have been around to help me. I couldn't have helped you this time, Delilah. This child you lost, it was a mercy. You'll be grateful for this someday. My guy, even if you felt like that, time and place. Time and freaking place. And that's the last straw for Delilah, and she cuts ties with him for good. They never ever see each other again, and they never speak again. Delilah gets released from the hospital just in time for her graduation, which Minerva attends and attempts to reconcile, but Delilah rebuffs her and says she has no family. She then packs up her stuff and heads to California. Now, I'm going to kind of fly through her years in California for time reasons, so just stay with me here. Delilah ends up working in a health food store and earning her own way, having left the Templeton money behind. She lives with Nick's ex-girlfriend Dory, who is psychic. This is one of my favorite bits in the book, because it's initially played as a joke, but no, she's actually an incredibly powerful psychic. Put a pin in that. While working at the store, Delilah starts making her own herbal tea and quickly gains a lot of success. So much so that she reaches out to an LA PR firm where she meets Max Kaplan, who runs the firm. And he is very much a charming, kind of suave LA guy in his 40s, so he's about 20 years older than her. And he helps her take Merlin's to the next level, and soon Delilah is wildly rich once again, and she and Max fall in love and marry, and they're delightfully happy. But we can't have nice things. So about 10 years later, so it's 1980 at this point, Delilah gets word that David, her father, has died, but per his request, he's not having any kind of service or funeral. So despite Minerva, who called to give her the news, wanting her to come home, Delilah decides not to. She and David hadn't spoken since that day in the hospital, and while she's saddened by his death, their relationship never recovered. Eventually, Max and Delilah decide to have a child, but they're unable to get pregnant, and when he goes to the doctor to get checked out, Max is diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. He's a heavy smoker and has been since he was a teenager. He fights as best he can for a few years, but he's suffering and decides to take his own life. And Delilah helps him and is with him when she dies. She is absolutely shattered by this and considers taking her own life after, but instead decides to take Max's advice and return to Boston and take back what has always been rightfully hers. So she sells her shares of Merlin and heads back to Boston. After a considerable length of time, we are in fact back at the main story. Like I said, this book is quite the saga. So Travis and Delilah set about trying to prove themselves. Delilah is trying to bring a more modern spin to Templeton tea to bring in a new, younger customer base with a modern ad campaign and new packaging. And Travis isn't really doing anything much differently. He still feels at this point that Templeton tea is as good as his. Again, he's worked as a BP for years and has been very successful at it. But he also feels that Minerva owes the company to him for blowing up his life all those years ago. And besides, he's really busy smuggling in cocaine. Like by the crateful. And he's been doing this for years, unbeknownst to anyone else in the company. Basically, he's in charge of importing tea, and every so often there will be a shipment of cocaine instead. He's not selling the cocaine, just doing it with his friends. And listen, I get that it was the 80s, but this seems like a lot of cocaine. And while Travis and Delilah are participating in The Apprentice, Nick is working on his latest book, a biography of Helen Templeton herself. And it seems like the longer this contest between Travis and Delilah goes on, and the more research Nick does into Helen's life, the worse the haunting at Minerva's house gets. It seems like Helen is desperately trying to tell Minerva something. And one night she compels Minerva to find a secret compartment in her fireplace where she hid her journal. And when she finally tells Nick about all the weird stuff that's been happening, to his credit, he absolutely believes her and suggests they call his old friend Dory to come and have a seance. And while Minerva admits there's definitely something odd going on, she's not necessarily a believer in all this, but she does agree. So Dory comes to Boston and tells Delilah that she should come back to California because the vibes around her are bad. And Dory is convinced that Delilah is in danger, which Delilah kind of laughs off. But my girl Dory is right, because you want to know who else is not only carrying a torch for Delilah, but it's become an obsession? Travis. Travis. For his sister. For his sister. And he knows she's his sister. He knows. He's known for 10 years at this point. And it's not a deal breaker, apparently. But in addition to the weird tension with Travis, Delilah is also growing closer to Nick. They're both older and have been through a lot of things and have come out the other side, and they're getting closer and closer. So, again, incestuous love triangle. Great. So Nick, Minerva, and Dory have a seance and channel Helen's spirit and learn that all of this tragedy really started with her. And the curse that plagues the family is one of repetition. There is danger, physical and psychological danger to you and others. This is Dory speaking, or rather Dory's spirit guide speaking through her. Of repetition or near repetition of a family tragedy. This has happened before in your family. Repetition. While Helen never married, the love of her life and her son's father was a man named Matthew Broadhurst, the town minister and Cotton Mather's protege. But he was already married. And if anyone found out they were having a child, they could have been hanged, because it would have been adultery, which in colonial Boston was a capital crime. So to protect Matthew, Helen refused to name the father of her child, Charles. So while Matthew died fairly young, he had 3 children with his wife. And Charles married one of his daughters, unknowingly marrying his half-sister and having 3 children of his own. Eventually, Charles figured all this out and confronted his mother, affirmed everything. Why she didn't warn him before he got married, I could not tell you, but here we are. Distraught and horrified by what he'd done, Charles killed his wife and set the house on fire to kill his children, and then killed himself. And this is what set the family curse in motion. Context, this is Nick talking after their seance. I'm right, Helen's silence, necessary though it was, had tragic results. What do you mean? It activated the curse. Suicide? No, not suicide, Gran. Incest. Incest is the Templeton curse? The curse is early death, I guess, but it's the crime of incest that brought the curse upon us. It's that old tradition, the sins of the father are visited on the children, and so on. And Nick is very much right. Because this was never dealt with, the cycle just keeps repeating within the family. The misery, the death, the suffering, the repeated accidental incest. Repetition. And I'm absolutely here for this, okay? Generational trauma represented as a literal curse that has to be acknowledged and dealt with, or the cycle of suffering will continue. I love it. So, because Minerva has eyes and common sense, she sees Travis flirting with Delilah, and one night she sees them leaving on a literal date. So she, again, understandably freaks out and calls Nick, begging him to stop them. And he's like, yeah, I don't like it either, but at the end of the day, they're both adults and we can't do anything. Sorry. So Minerva tells him the truth, that Travis is Delilah's brother. Meanwhile, on their date, Travis and Delilah are having a kind of come-to-Jesus moment. He finally expresses regret for everything that happened between them and apologizes to her. And she finally gets to express to him just how badly he hurt her. This conversation has been a long time coming, and it's good they finally have it. We love healthy communication. We don't love trying to take your sister home with you for the night. Luckily, Nick shows up, thank God, and as they're getting in the car and tells Delilah not to go with him. And he and Travis start arguing and then literally fighting in the street, as you do, I guess. And Travis says Nick is a jealous loser who just wants Delilah for himself, which after Nick lays Travis out, counters with, yeah, maybe, but at least I'm not trying to sleep with my sister. He's better than me, because he says this much more cryptically. Basically just letting Travis know, I know, and I know what you're doing, and it's wrong, and it's weird. I love mess, so I was absolutely living for this. So Travis, humiliated and angry, and realizing that Minerva told Nick, takes off. Delilah, kinda horrified by what just happened, also takes off, and Nick follows her. Eventually, Delilah realizes that the reason the spark her and Travis, at least on her end, hadn't reignited is because she's in love with Nick and has been all along, so they finally get together. Yay? I guess. I don't know. It's better than sleeping with your brother, so I'll take it. And they are both consenting adults. I'm not thrilled with it, but I'll take it. Back to Travis. He goes to confront Minerva. And he's resented her for years. And this contest between him and Delilah, which he's losing, by the way, has only made that anger worse. And her telling Nick was the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. So he gives her an ultimatum. Fire Delilah, resign, and sign the company over to him, or he'll tell everyone the dark secret which she's been hiding all these years. Which Minerva's like, which one, baby? My secrets have secrets. And he's like, the murder. The murder. Because, plot twist, it turns out Harrison didn't fall down the stairs all those years ago. He was trying to assault Minerva and was actually going to beat her with the cane that he used, to get around with, when she pushed him away from her and he fell down the stairs and died. Once again, I say good. But Travis and Nick, who were staying with Minerva while their mother was dying, heard the argument and came out to see what was going on. But Nick was really young and thought he was having a nightmare and suppressed the trauma. But Travis never forgot. And while he fully acknowledges that he doesn't have proof of any of this, the scandal would probably be enough to ruin her and probably at least hurt the business, and she has until tomorrow morning to do what he wants. So that night, after they sleep together, Nick tells horrified Delilah that Travis is her brother and that he knew he was her brother while actively trying to seduce her. Also that they, Nick and Delilah, are reincarnated soulmates, which he learned during past life regression. Sure. And Minerva takes her own life. Sorry, there was no way to make that not tonally unhinged, so here we are. So why does she do it? Guilt, I think. Everything that she has ever done, no matter how cruel, has been to protect her family, something that in her eyes she has failed at time and time again. She couldn't protect Travis from seeing all that as a kid. She'd set Jonathan on the path that would throw him, Sarah, and David together and ruin all their lives. She betrayed Delilah, and now the worst of her sins was going to be laid bare before the people she loved most. Everything she'd done, every awful thing, every betrayal, every cruelty, every lie, was all for nothing. And in her own words, even now she was adding to her sins. Instead of facing the consequences of her actions, she was running away. All her life she'd wanted respectability and aberration. She couldn't endure the thought that the scandalous details of her life would come out and she would have to face Nick and Delilah, not to mention everyone else, and acknowledge the true state of her soul. Even at the end, she needed to be in control. So she takes a handful of pills and takes her own life. So Nick ends up going to check on Minerva in the morning and finds her after she's taken the pills, and she's rushed to the hospital. And she ends up in a coma, which she does not wake up from. And Nick and Delilah are at her side as she's passing away. And before she does, Delilah finally makes her peace with her grandmother, and Minerva makes peace with Delilah. She passes on knowing that for all her failings, her family is going to be okay, and she's made peace with the person that she loves most. This scene gets me every time, okay? It does not matter how many times I read it, I still cry like a baby every single time. When Minerva's will is read after her funeral, her grandkids and her great-granddaughter are generously provided for, but both the company and the family home now belong to Delilah. And when Travis asked when the will was updated, it turns out that Minerva changed it literally only a few weeks after Delilah came home. So Minerva planned to leave everything to her all along. And Travis takes this about as well as you'd expect, which is to say really badly. He starts drinking and missing tons of work, and when Delilah is taking a TV crew through their packing plant, a segment about local businesses on the local news, it's kind of like a daytime news thing, a brick of cocaine falls on her head. It's not funny. She has some of her people investigate and find several crates filled with it. All of them personally brought in and shipped in by Travis. Delilah confronts him about using the family business as a drug smuggling front. He tries to brush it off. He's like, I'm not selling it, I'm just using it. Come on, Delilah, be cool. Also, I'm in love with you and we should get married. Unhinged behavior, honestly. And she rejects him, telling him that she and Nick are getting married soon. And Travis leaves. Now, it's Halloween night because drama. Nick is working on the autobiography of Helen Templeton, and Delilah is going to bed after the last of the trick-or-treaters have gone home. They're in the Templeton family home at this point. And it's at this point that Travis, having completely lost the plot, breaks in. His plan? I'm so glad you asked. He's going to kill Nick and Delilah and make it look like a murder-suicide because they found out that they were brothers and sister by leaving his mother's note that simply addressed him my son, so that they'll think it was actually addressed to Nick and that when he found out he killed Delilah and then himself. Because if they're both dead, he gets everything. So he knocks Nick out and handcuffs him to the ladder in the library and goes to confront Delilah. But Nick comes up with a plan. He knocks over a lit jack-o'-lantern and starts a small fire. Because the house is a historical building, it has built-in alarms that connect directly to the fire department, so help is going to come. Meanwhile, Delilah, now possessed by the ghost of Helen Templeton, it's not funny, tells Travis that this is absolutely crazy, because it is, and he doesn't have to do this. They can break the cycle and end the curse here. They can end the repetition. And Travis finally sees reason and gives her the gun. He had a gun, by the way. But, unfortunately, the small fire that Nick started turns out to have grown into a very not small fire. Travis and Delilah are able to rescue Nick, who had lost consciousness due to the smoke, and Helen's ghost helps guide the three of them through the smoke and fire. And they're nearly down the stairs when a burning beam falls on Travis, and he falls down the stairs and dies, just like Harrison Templeton did all those years earlier. Both Nick and Delilah survive relatively unharmed, and the damage to the house is minimal, and they vowed to rebuild and to go on and live their lives as happily as they can. In 1730, because surprise, Helen wasn't actually a ghost. She's been astral projecting to the future this whole time. Helen is finally able to be at peace. She's able to let go, having saved her family and lifted the curse. She can die and be at peace knowing they'll be okay. Not only that, there is someone waiting for her when she does get to the other side. Across the gulf, she heard a much longed for, beloved voice. Turning quickly, she loosed the smile that had enchanted a city and bewitched a man. Matt? Her spirit, always so full of love and joy and laughter, grew fuller still, for her lover, whom she had not seen since his death 40 years before, was urging her to soar with him again, high over Boston, the wild Atlantic Ocean, the blue-wrapped earth. Matt, she whispered, and took his hand. Oh, like I said, that was a journey. And Leaves a Fortune truly has something for everyone. Ghosts, murder, family dysfunction, witches, tea, literal and figurative, and so much mess and so much drama. It's a truly unhinged masterpiece of melodrama that really takes a genuinely interesting look at generational trauma and the way that it can affect generations unless you actually deal with it. Presenting it as being a literal curse on the family, which it very much is. So thank you so much for coming on this journey with me and for listening to all that. And until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.